So, so one of, let's see, there we go. So one of the reasons I don't want to go over it because I know we're taking a very complex and probably little known subject. And if anybody is joining us tonight that has a lot of familiarity with Georgian wines or history or the region, I would love to get your take on things because it's a very, very complex country to talk about. For everything, not just for the wine, but in terms of the political history, in terms of the topography, in terms of the cultural history of the region, the winemaking history. There's a lot going on in this area. I'm going to certainly do my best with Georgian terms. I have actually been to Georgia before. I was able to go on a trip, a wine trip in 2016, and things I know have actually changed radically since I was there. When I was in Georgia in 2016, there were around 400 wineries, and by 2019, there were around 1,300. So that probably hasn't increased too much in the last few years because of COVID. But when I was there in 2016, the construction everywhere was just ever present, and people were building wineries and resorts and hotels and infrastructure for tourism and things that come with that. So hopefully I can convey in a way today sort of a sense of the Georgian culture around wine and food and the history. But as we always say, if you've been there, I want to hear from you as well. Tomorrow, when I send out the recording, I'm going to actually send, I haven't really included any like to do things because I know it changed so much since I was there. But I will include, if anybody's planning a trip to Georgia, Rachel, hopefully, I will include some links to some of the tourism websites and some of the companies that I know to be reputable for showing people around, especially to the wine region, so that if you are planning a trip, you can go ahead and do that as well. So we'll get started as usual. If you need to jump off and we're running over, please feel free. I'll send out the recording tomorrow. If you have any questions, just interrupt, let me know, or put it in the chat box. Today's a fun class. I had a really good time revisiting Georgian wines and culture, studying for this class, 2016. In years, it doesn't really seem that long ago, but in time, it really, at this point, it feels like a long time, right? Especially with everything that's happened in the past 2 years. And as I mentioned, how rapidly the Georgian wine culture and economy is growing. So why do we call it the cradle of wine? Definitively, we know that there have been more than 8,000 continuous vintages produced in Georgia. This is probably the birthplace of wine. We haven't actually found anywhere quite yet that's older that I'm aware of. Maybe, maybe there's something I'm not aware of, but they really take it very seriously, the wine culture seriously. This is the Alaverde Monastery in the Alizani Valley. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. So the monastery was built during to ward off the Turk during the Ottoman invasion. Yes, we'll look at where we're bordered at: Azerbaijan, Turkey, Russia, Armenia. We have a lot of borders surrounding the area. As you can imagine, it was a really kind of hotly contested area from the people around it, who also wanted to incorporate Georgia into their own countries, right? So we deal with a lot of that in the history. The Alaverde Monastery, aside from producing wine, also makes honey. They grow vegetables and fruits and other types of crops, as you'll see, it's very common within Georgia. So of course, we'll talk about the history, a little bit of the philosophy, of course, the appellation, and Georgian cuisine, because just as is so common with many countries that we talk about around the world and in Europe especially, what grows together goes together. Georgian wine goes best with Georgian food. In this photo, these are creverie. These are pictures of creverie, the clay vessels or sort of amphora, as we call them elsewhere, that are typically buried in the ground or used to ferment and store and sometimes move wine. Now, the traditional creverie that we talk about is this larger size like this. Oftentimes they can be 1,000 liters. And these are above ground. These are just for they're just for show. They're for people to see. Typically, creverie are buried into the ground, and we'll talk about the concept of that. I apologize. There's not a lot. This, as I mentioned, this is the best reference for the wines of Georgia. Anything else, there's some really good stuff on like the Georgian kind of like wine tourism board and things like that. But there are not a lot of resources for learning about Georgian wine and not a lot of great maps. So I apologize. Some of these, I would wish they were a little bit high quality, but it was just what I was able to find online. So we are beneath Russia, above Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Georgia itself, it's smaller than the Republic of Ireland. So it's a fairly small country. If we think about Georgia overall, in terms of wine growing, there are 7 different climatic zones. We're going to look at more of a topographical map in a moment. 7 different climatic zones and more than 49 recognized soil types within the region. So we have a very rich geological history here, and it's very difficult to define the region that you see here, the wine growing region, really just by climate or just by soil type. So we might talk about specific soils in some regions where it's a little bit more homogeneous, but that's actually very rare. So the main regions are for wine growing are Kakheti, which is in the eastern side of Georgia over here. This is where we find the majority of the PDOs, or protected designation of origin, the appellations, protected appellations within Georgia. We also have Shida Kartli and Kivemo Kartli, upper and lower Kartli. These are the closest to the capital of Georgia, which is Tbilisi. We have the Samsky, Javakheti, Imereti. This is the second most important wine growing region next to Kakheti. We have Raqqa, Lakumi, Semigrelo, Guria, and Adjara. These are the main regions that we'll be talking about today. What else could I tell you about Georgia to start off? You can see here that we have the Caucasus mountain range kind of running primarily sort of pretty much east to west in this region, separating it, creates a natural border of Georgia with Russia. And a lot of Georgia is quite mountainous. Then the eastern part of Georgia, Kakheti, this wine region over here that we mentioned, this is the driest region. The rest of Georgia can be quite mountainous. It can be very wintry. It can also be quite humid, especially if we get to these regions that are closer to the Black Sea as well. So let's talk about the history. 8,000 vintages, right? So I love putting this together because when we talk about a lot of the even more modern European wine regions, right? We usually start history sometimes with Phoenicians, usually with the Romans, but we're usually talking about maybe like the 3rd, the 4th, the 6th century BCE, if we're before the Common Era. The history of winemaking in Georgia starts in the 1st century of the 6th millennium before the Common Era. So we know that winemaking is thought to be begun this early or possibly even earlier. This is due to the findings of like older amphora or clay pots that had grape pollen in them. They weren't thought to be close enough to any ancient vineyards that the grape pollen could have landed inside of the pot, maybe from table grapes that were grown and not for producing wine by the wind or something like that. We also see clay vessels and community rooms throughout these earlier civilizations that were thought to be used for winemaking. And clay matter tested positive for many of the types of different acids that we find in wine today. Tartaric acid, malic acid, succinic acid, and citric acids were found in these clay pots. From 4000 to 2000 millennium BCE, the early Transcaucasian culture emerges in the southern Caucasus, and it spread to the Near East. This is probably one of the first instances of wine production and consumption spreading across the Middle East. The Trialeti culture had burial sites dating back to 1500 BCE that were unearthed and found to contain goblets of gold and silver. And these depicted drinking scenes, ceremonies, and an excavation in 2015 unearthed 8 creverie dating back to the first millennium BCE as well. From the 13th to the 5th century, we developed a culture with direct link to the Greek, the Achaemenid, the Phoenician, and nomadic cultures. And as we skip forward a little bit, the 4th century of the Common Era, Christianity arrives in Georgia, and Georgia becomes a Christian nation in 337. So again, more links to wine culture as we recognize it today as well. Skipping forward, in 1801, Georgia is annexed into the Russian Empire for the first time. Can everybody see everybody can see my screen, right? Got like getting a little notes on. Okay, nobody's saying they can't. I got like a weird little Zoom note. Okay.
Yeah, looks okay.
What's that?
It looks fine. You packed a lot on it, so I have to study it after the fact, but it comes through well.
Yeah, I'm gonna send these out as always. As always, we're gonna send this out. So in 1801, Georgia is annexed into the Russian Empire during the imperial period of 1801 through 1917. During this time, there was actually quite a few winemakers that would travel to Western Europe. They would bring back vine cuttings, a lot of Western European grape growing and winemaking technology during this time. A lot of French varieties ended up in Georgia. There was a Prince Alexandra Chavadze was an ambassador for Georgian wine during this time. He was a leading producer at home and abroad, and some of his vineyards and winery is still utilized in production today as well. And then Western diseases, as with most of Europe and the rest of the world, begin to arrive in the mid-1800s, odium, fungal diseases, and even phylloxera. So it was thought at the time that a lot of the hardier kind of European vines and hybrids would be resistant to phylloxera, but this is probably what brought phylloxera into the region. And when we talk about these wine areas too, we always say, we oftentimes use a timeline to establish the really important instances that sort of changed the course of winemaking history. But there was a lot going on here, right? So not only do we have phylloxera, we also have the end of the Russian imperial period. We have the revolution. In 1918, after the revolution, Georgia declared independence, but it was a very short period of time. The Red Army incorporates Georgia into the Soviet Union in 1921. And of course, up until the really the mid 2000s, could be a very dark period for Georgian history, and certainly not to make light of it. But as it pertains to wine, we'll talk about a little bit more. But more than 50,000 Georgians, notably the clergy and nobility during this time, were murdered. The vineyard area, of course, shrinks. A lot of the livelihood of the peasants who lived in the more rural areas, who worked the land, vineyards, other types of agriculture, vegetables, fruits, plants, things like that, lost a lot of their livelihood. But it was actually Stalin who saw the kind of the value in the winemaking of Georgia. And Georgia kind of became, during this period, almost like Russia's vineyard. It was warmer, it was further south, the weather was a lot better. And the Soviets really pushed mass production onto the more kind of low-lying, very fertile, very high-yielding plains. But it did bring back a little bit of income to the farmers who were working these lands as well. During this time, the Soviet Union really pushed what we would call, so we'll talk a lot today about European and traditional winemaking in Georgia. Traditional winemaking is always in the creverie, which we'll get into in a moment, right? So the European winemaking is usually wine that's made, white wines that are made without skin contact, white wines that are typically made today in something like stainless steel, cement, or possibly oak barrels. We don't see a lot of oak in Georgia, but there is some. But during this time, the home winemaking really continued by traditional methods. And I'm laughing because we're going to talk about in a moment how everybody, we had almost like more than doubled in the terms of wineries and winemakers that we have in the past, 6 years, right? And everybody kind of says, well, I can do this. My grandfather was a winemaker, because Georgia is the type of place where literally everybody made wine at home. Oftentimes they grew grapes and then they sold grapes to the co-ops, and then they had their own grape production and winemaking at home in the traditional method. In 1991, Georgia declared independence, but it was really kind of a dark time, especially until 1993. But even after, Civil War broke out, there was an incredibly corrupt government during this time as well. As it pertained to winemaking and grape growing, a lot of the Soviet collective farmland during this time was split up, and parcels that were as small as about 1.25 hectares were handed out to the collective farm workers. And this really further fragmented a lot of the vineyard properties. And because also congruent with this was a decline of the kind of collective co-ops after the fall of the Soviet Union, this really left these growers with, just over 1 hectare of grapes, but nobody to purchase them. And so a lot of the vineyards were abandoned during this time. And what we're seeing today is a lot of growers that are bringing back perhaps their family vineyard, but also buying vineyards or purchasing grapes from other growers. Now, nobody has mentioned, and I didn't ask yet, but sometimes I hear questions about quality in Georgian wine, that sometimes there is some microbial issues, some spoilage in Georgian wine. The example that I was talking about with my wine, which is cooked, that is probably my fault. That probably had nothing to do with how the wine was actually made. That's something that happens, once the wine is being stored. So that's probably my fault due to both the way that I stored it and the fact that I kept this wine for 7 years when it was probably meant for more immediate consumption. But as I was saying as well, is today a lot of growers or winemakers have wineries that are not connected to vineyards because of this fragmentation, right? So a lot of these winemakers will purchase grapes, but Georgia is such a young industry for wine, even though they have this incredibly long history. Jancis Robinson calls Georgia and some of the surrounding countries like Armenia and places like that are making wine too. Sometimes she calls them the new old world, right? Because we recognize their incredible history as it pertains to the culture of wine, but globally and in a modern wine understanding of winemaking, they really are quite young. So there's a lot of handshake deals when it comes to buying these grapes. A lot of the winemakers are separated from their grapes by hours. And although Georgia is quite small, once you're getting away from Tbilisi, and if you're not in Kakheti, which is the most easy region to visit for wine, the roads are not great. You really oftentimes need 4-wheel drive vehicles. You oftentimes will need a guide. So the infrastructure really is not there. So it will take much longer to get anywhere because of the roads and the infrastructure than you would think just by looking at the distance by land, right? So keep that in mind too. In 2000, this was important, kind of a side note, but Josko Grosvenor, who was a very famous 1980s and 1990s white winemaker, very well known for his really kind of just classic, I would say, European styles of white wine coming out of Northeast Italy, traveled to Georgia. And he had been reading for a few years about some of the other sort of traditional winemaking styles of the world. And he really became interested in the Creverie wines from Georgia. He traveled there in 2000. He came back with a couple of Creverie. And by the mid 2000s, he was making all of his wines in Creverie. So because he was such a famous white winemaker in Italy and he switched his entire production and the way he made wine, this really sort of shone a light on these traditional winemaking styles in Georgia that a lot of global wine grapes we're not even aware of at the time, right? So by the mid 2000s, Josko Grabner is fermenting all of his wines in Crevery clay pots that he brought back from Georgia that were buried in the ground. And in 2006 to 2013, also something really important happened, is that there is a Russian embargo against the importation of Georgian wine to Russia. And at that time in 2006, almost 90% of all of the wine that was produced in Georgia, right, Russia's vineyard, was still being sent to Russia. So, things really could have gone a couple of different ways, right? If we just think about what we know about countries in the world that are coming out from under Soviet rule, that are looking to share their wines with a more global market. A lot of countries, and this happened with some of the other countries in, I shouldn't say a lot, but some of the other countries in like Eastern Europe, places like Romania, Bulgaria, they really turned to international grape varieties, right? Rather than sort of championing their own traditional grapes and winemaking practices in the region, they accepted a lot of money from the EU. They bought oak barrels, they got Merlot and Cabernet and Syrah and Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc. And they made good examples of those wines. But they're newer plantings, they're young vines, they're oftentimes the grape varieties are not necessarily matched to terroir. So they're well-made wines, but maybe they're not the most quality or the most interesting, right? So Georgia really could have gone in that direction, but instead, congruent again with this time in the early 2000s after Josko Grabner visited, there was a small group of underground winemakers who were really interested in revitalizing the Georgian traditional style. And in 2005 or 2006, there was sort of a wine blog called Marani. Marani is the Georgian term for like winery or wine cellar. There was a kind of an online forum or blog called Marani, which brought together a lot of these sort of like-minded Georgian winemakers who really wanted to promote these traditional styles. So Georgian winemakers and growers after 2006 began looking for a lot of other paths for, one, exporting their wine. Once they realized that they lost their main export market, which was Russia, who had been drinking their wines already for 90 years, like 90 years or more, right? They started looking to other wine growing countries in the world. They started taking notes on improving quality, and they begin to focus most importantly on their indigenous varieties and traditional winemaking. So this really could have gone in a different direction, right? And I think we can be really grateful to the Georgian winemakers in the early 2000s who really pushed the traditional styles. And this was really the beginning of the kind of the Georgian artisan or artisanal winemaking that we really see today. The Russian export market has opened back up post 2013, and they still do drink about 60% of all of the wine that Georgia produces. And Georgia today produces both these European styles that might be in stainless steel, cement, or oak, and their traditional style. So they certainly make both. And the Russian market is usually drinks more of the traditional European styles. And some of what we'll talk about, these semi-sweet styles that we have the PDO, protected designation of origin region, that became important and popular under the Soviet Union. So since 2016, as we know, production had doubled. In a lot of cases, quality had increased, but not always. Production had doubled because we've seen a lot of grape growers who decided that they wanted to jump on the bandwagon and become winemakers. And somebody who grows grapes, a farmer, does not always know the best technique for making wine. The Crevery is a great raw material for winemaking, but it has to be cleaned very well. And we talk a lot about natural wines in Georgia. Not all wines are natural. Certainly nothing that's going to be made in these tanks can be natural, right? Because there would just be too many opportunities for bacterial flaws and spoilage. But even with the Crevery and the smaller cellars, you really have to be quite careful to make sure that those are clean. And if the wines are traveling outside of Georgia, that they're going to arrive at their destination with the integrity that the winemaker intended. So these are just a couple of photos that I included from wineries that were established during the Soviet era. On the right-hand side, this is at a winery called Marani, which is essentially Georgian for wine cellar. It's one of Georgia's largest producers today. And you can just see these Soviet era tanks that are, I mean, there's like 10 to 15 in this row, and there must have been a dozen rows in this room. On the left-hand side, these ones are not in use, they're sitting outside, but just another example of, this was actually at a winery where they're turning back toward, they were doing a lot of like Soviet era kind of winemaking, mass production, European style, but they're really beginning to turn back towards a little bit more of this artisanal style, more traditional Georgian winemaking. And it's not uncommon for some of these wineries to actually do two lines and have two styles of production, the traditional Georgian style and then a more European style. So these ones are out of use, they're just outside. But again, just seeing a little bit of the, of how we're moving forward, right? The progress of the Georgian winemaking community. So these are the tools that we more often see for the traditional Georgian winemaking. So the creverie will be buried in the ground. These are quite large, usually somewhere around 1,000 liters, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller. They can fit 1 or 2 people inside to clean them up. They're always pointed. There's a kind of like a tip at the bottom for the skin to settle at the bottom of the creverie. So this is really important to the winemaking. The skins, especially in the Kakhetian method, the eastern part of Georgia, are really important to the winemaking. They call the skin the mother of the wine. And in Kakheti, they say that they raise the juice the wine raises itself with its mother in these creverie for usually around 6 months on the skin for white wines, which is an astronomical amount of time for white wine to spend on the skin. So this is more of a modern cellar that you would see with the creverie buried in the ground. Here's another example. Typically during the fermentation, the lids would be left off. After the fermentation, they would be covered with wooden or stone slabs to prevent oxidation, although there's not that much opportunity with this quite small hole. And then after maybe like 3 to 6 months, the juice will usually be racked off of the skins and into another clean creverie to age for another number of years. So they're kind of the traditional tools. You see these even in modern wineries for stirring the juice and scrubbing down the creverie in between fermentation to clean it. And then it's also common to see creverie outside, just buried in the ground. This would be your really common, what you would see behind somebody's home for their home winemaking. They might have one creverie buried in the backyard that they use every year for their harvest, whichever grape they're harvesting, right? Arcatzatelli, Saperavi, Shavcapito, Kisi, and so forth. In Kakheti, it's much more common for the creverie to be inside like this. In Western Georgia, it's quite common for them to be outside. This is actually in Kakheti at a winery called Our Wines, but in Western Georgia, sometimes they're just outside like that, or they could be just under sort of like a barn roof, right? With open sides or maybe some kind of a lean-to so that you can work with the juice and take the lid off the creverie, even if it's raining or the water is inclement. And the purpose of burying the creverie in the ground is there's a couple of reasons. It helps the ambient temperature of the juice, especially as it's fermenting. It's kept inside of the cooler ground. It is neutral. It doesn't impart any flavor, the creverie, into the wine. As the wine settles, especially if it sits here for 3-6 months, it naturally finds and filters itself. And the tip of the creverie at the very bottom is important because those skins actually fall into that little tip. And it's helped prevent some of the reduction that you might get if the whole cap of the juice or the whole bottom of the vessel was covered in skins touching the wine during this time as well. It also gathers those skins, so it's really easy to rack that clear wine off the top when you're ready. So using Qvevri can be a very kind of a more minimalistic approach to winemaking, but this doesn't mean that you can let the wine make itself, right? So we'll talk a little bit about Georgian culture. I hope everybody's still with me. I know we're going through a lot, but I always hope that having this little bit of understanding really helps us be able to learn more later on. So we know a little bit about the culture of wine already. And we know that the Georgians kept their own traditional cultures really alive since the 6th millennium BCE, because we also had many times where parts of what is today Georgia were occupied by the Ottoman Empire and the Turks, who also frowned upon winemaking. We know that during Russian occupation, during the Soviet Union, the style of winemaking that they were really asked to perform was not really what the cultural winemaking and history of Georgia was all about, right? So let's talk just slightly about the culture. There's a couple of things that are really important. The Qvevri, which we already talked about, these are the clay vessels used for making wine according to the Georgian winemaking tradition. In Western Georgia, they're known as churi. So traditionally, you'll almost always see the term Qvevri or Qvevri. In Georgia, you pronounce every consonant. So even when they're next to each other, I mean, I think the only example like CH is still pronounced like a cha, but you really pronounce each letter. So it's quite a phonetic language, which can actually make it a lot easier when you're looking at it and you want to try and speak something in Georgian with a long words, could be, 8, 9 letters, and you have 3 consonants all next to each other. It can be a little confusing. So the legend of Georgia and how the people came to occupy the land really started around the Supra. And the Supra is, it's a Georgian feast that is ritualized by eating and drinking. And this eating and drinking that goes on for hours is punctuated by ceremonial toast. And so typically at each Supra, and a Supra is held for every holiday, every celebration or family gathering, when you have friends in town. The Georgians like to say that guests are a gift from God. So if you have guests coming over, it's usually a reason to throw a supra. And in a supra, plates will be brought to the table, just like you see here, until there's so little room, they actually have to be stacked on the corners of the other plate just to make room. We'll talk about some of these foods a little bit later on. So the legend goes that on the day that God was meeting with all of the people of the earth to give his people the land that they would live on, the Georgians were busy. The Georgians were at Supra. They were eating, they were drinking, they were toasting. Their ceremonial toast will include not just toasting to their ancestors, their loved ones, their friends, but they oftentimes include talks about politics. Usually they might recite poetry or literature, and these usually have one toastmaster for a dinner. And being a good tamada or toastmaster in Georgia is an incredibly important skill. Nobody wants to be at a supra with a bad tamada. You always want to have a great toastmaster. So the Georgians were busy. They were eating, they were drinking, they were toasting, they were at the supra, and they showed up late to their meeting with God. And when they arrived, undoubtedly very full and probably a little bit drunk, God was quite upset, and he'd already given out all of the land of the world. So as he was chastising the Georgians, the tamada stood up and he said, "But God, as we were toasting, as we were singing, as we were praising, we were extolling your name. We were praising your name, and we were praising all of the beautiful lands that you have created." And God was so impressed that he ended up giving the Georgians the small piece of land of paradise that he had been saving for himself. So this is sort of the story about how the Georgians came to occupy one of the most beautiful places on earth. And if you go, I think you will certainly agree with that as well. Also important to the kind of the Georgian wine culture and tradition is skin maceration. Obviously, we use this for red grapes, of course, but also very traditionally for white wine. Now, we have the Kakhetian method, that eastern part of Georgia, where whole grape bunches are placed into a kind of a wooden trough known as a saknakeli, and then they're lightly foot trodden and crushed, and then run into the creverie, and the whites remain in the creverie with the skin for 3 to 6 months. So this is, as we mentioned before, a really long time. The red will be destemmed typically. The whites are in Kakheti. We actually typically use the stems in the fermentation in the creverie, which is uncommon in Western Georgia. This is because when you looked at that topographical map, right? You can see, what do we have? We have a rain shadow, right? So this is a much warmer area. So here the stems can get ripe enough to use in the fermentation. In years that are a little bit cooler, you might go to a winery and you might actually see a winery selecting the percentage of skin that they want to use in the creverie. And you might also see them taking the stems and leaving them out in the sun to lignify a little bit, to ripen, so that they can then go back and add the stems with the skins and the juice into the creverie. So they sit there for 3 to 6 months. Reds are typically destemmed, and they usually only sit on the skins for 1 month. And when we talk about some of these grapes, you'll definitely see why. In the western part of Georgia, in Imereti, the Imeretian method also uses creverie or churi wines, as we call them. And they usually don't include the stems. They typically are not ripe enough. And we usually limit the maceration with both the skins for white and red wines for around 1 month. So most of people that are familiar with Georgian wine, to an extent, associate the Kakhetian method with all Georgian wines, but that's not actually correct. So the Kakheti wines are always much deeper in color. They're usually the most tannic of the Georgian amber wines, and they don't use the term orange wines in Georgia. They call their wines amber wines. And the Western Georgian styles can be a little bit fresher. And sometimes you have whites that aren't even made with very much of the skins at all. So they won't have that really kind of tannic amber or orange color and edge to the palate. Oak can be used. It is quite rare, but some of the larger wineries will use some oak in the production of some of their saperavi or some of the red wines. There is a PDO in Kakheti that is known for oak on its saperavi. Usually the oak will come from France, French oak, but there's also a lot of oak that comes from the northern Caucasian oak forest. Just on the border with Russia as well. They like the more northern side, where it's a little bit cooler and the grain is actually a little bit tighter. And then the Morani, as we mentioned, is the wine cellar. It's outside, outside in the western part and inside in Kakheti. So a few of these grape varieties. There are 525 recognized indigenous grape varieties in Georgia. So how long do you guys have? I'm kidding. So what I tried to do was just pick what I find to be some of the most commonly seen in my market here in New York. These would probably might be a lot more difficult to get if you're outside of the New York market. Most commonly, you're going to see Arkatsatelli for white and Saperavi for red. Those are the top two grape varieties. They were widely planted during the Soviet era, just because they did well. They had high yields, they were easy to make. So they were really widely planted all over Georgia, even though most of those probably originated in Kakheti. So you might see Chunuri. It's really fantastic for these kind of fresh floral, herbal, and fresh high acid wines. Chunuri is often used for sparkling wine, especially in Atunuri, the PDO that you find in Kakheti. All wines, when they're made in creverie, because of a little bit of oxidation, and because usually it's very rare to make creverie wines without skin. There are a few producers like Gotza who is actually making like Chernuri in Crevery without the skin, and they're really cool wines, but just overall it's not that common. All Crevery wines, when it comes to whites especially, are going to be less fruity. They'll be more tannic because of that contact with the skin. They'll be a little bit more kind of musky or herbal or earthy. You have Garuli Mitvane. There are several varieties of Mitvane that are usually named for the area or the town that they're most associated with or thought to come from. Garuli Mitvane, meaning green from Gori, is a separate variety from the most common Mitvane, which is the one that comes from Kakheti. Garuli tend to be, Mitvane means green. So you can expect that any grapes that have the word Mitvane or called by Mitvane tend to have this kind of like bright lime, kiwi, kind of fresh green fruit style to them. Garuli Mitvane is oftentimes blended. Chernuri or Katsatelli, it tends to be best as a young wine. Kikvi, grown widely in Kakheti as well. It tends to be planted in the higher altitudes or cooler mountain areas. It's more apricot, honey, wildflowers. Kisi, the grape variety that I wanted to drink tonight, but I kept the bottle too long and didn't store it right. Kisi is a very aromatic wine. Sometimes I kind of liken it almost like the indigenous Georgian Sauvignon Blanc. It has a lot more tropical fruit, but it can also be kind of herbal in a way as well. The sort of green tea and tarragon, you tend to get this deeper orange, and in Crevery as well, you will get the nuttier character and the nuttier side of some of these wines as well. Sometimes I really love like Crevery wines tend to have this really beautiful kind of like sesame character to them, which is really beautiful. Krakuna means crispy, indigenous to Emirati. Has a much richer, more textured palate. You might even compare it almost to something like, Viognier with higher acidity and a little bit more kind of like tropical fruit. Mitvane Kakuri is the most common Mitvane that you'll see. The green from Kakheti, it means. Oftentimes, if you just see Mitvane on a label, it's probably going to be this one, or sometimes it could be a blend of these ones as well. It's a very old grape variety. Aside from the green notes, it has this like kind of grapefruit and citrus, and this beautiful balance of like floral, saline, and mineral characteristic. Arkatsatelli, what Sheila is drinking. This is the most planted white grape in Georgia. Native to Kakheti, but cultivated widely throughout the country during the Soviet era. It's much more subtle. It's much more like Chardonnay in terms of its aromatic profile. Definitely is a more neutral grape variety, but our Katsatelli really, really sings when it gets put into Crevery. It's a beautiful balance of tannin on the palate, but also with this kind of moderate acidity and depth. It's one of those wines that takes on a lot of like orange peel and nut and sesame characteristic to it. Titka, you'll find in Emirati, more yellow fruit, some pear, melon. Oftentimes it's blended with the following grape, Shulakuri. And Shulakuri is really, really common in the Black Sea and the regions that are adjacent to the Black Sea. It's also considered to be Emirati's most noble grape variety as well. For red grapes, you'll see Aladasturi, nearly wiped out by phylloxera, mostly planted in Emirati, and a lot of the grape varieties of Georgia that are red outside of Saperavi have a lighter character to them. If you've had Georgian red wine and it's been some version of Saperavi or maybe Alaskandruli made in a semi-sweet style, you might think that all Georgian wines are really kind of rich and bold and tannic and full-bodied, but that's not actually true. And a lot of the Western Georgian reds are going to be these kind of lighter, fresher, vin de soif styles of wine. Oftentimes they're made in a more natural style, so they do maybe have a little bit of funkiness to them too. Alaskandruli is a really famous grape, and it makes some very famous wines in the hillsides of Vakmalakumi. It is thin skin and light in tannin, but because it's often makes semi-dry styles, it can be considered to be a little bit of a fuller wine due to the addition or the leaving of the sugar in the wine. but it also retains acidity, which is why it can be made as a sweet or semi-sweet wine. When it's dry, it's a little earthy with tobacco. Chakveri is mostly grown. You see it a little bit in Imereti, but mostly in Ojara and Guria that are adjacent to the Black Sea. We're not really talking about Abkhazia today because it's a region, it's the closest, it's kind of the northwestern area of Georgia on the border with Russia. And it's a little bit politically unstable at the moment. So probably you wouldn't travel there. And I don't really know much about if or what any of the wine production is there at the time. Chukveri is trained often as a Maglari vine. So this is the first time we've seen this term. A Maglari vine, which is very common in Western Georgia, is a grapevine that's trained to grow up trees. And Chukveri is a really interesting red grape variety. It ripened very, very late. Usually you can't pick it until at least mid-November. And because it ripens so late, usually the tannins never get ripe enough on this red wine or this red grape. So it's almost always vinified instead of as a red, as a white or rosé wine to limit the skin contact. Actually, we had this grape variety by the glass recently at Cork Buzz. Gia is grown in Kakheti. It also is a little bit shy in anthocyanins. It can be this very like vin de soif style wine, very terroir expressive, much like something like Gamay from Beaujolais, a lot of cherry and berry and black pepper. Ojaleshi is a very old Georgian grape variety. It's thought to possibly have actually come from Turkey. It's also traditionally made in the trained in the Maglari vine style in Samagrelo, adjacent to the Black Sea. It really likes limestone soils. And as we mentioned, 49 different soil types in Georgia. It has more pomegranate and red fruit. It tends to have a little spice to it. Sapuravi, Georgia, leading red grape. Sapuravi, the word means to dye or something to color with, to dye like to dye your clothes, right? The most planted red grape. It's also very old. More than 40% of vineyard land in Kakheti is dedicated to Sapuravi. More than 10% of all of Georgia's plantings are Sapuravi. It is a true Teinturier grape variety, meaning that not just the colors contain skin, but the flesh of this red grape is colored as well, which is why it creates these intensely inky, very opaque wines. It has these beautiful flavors of like dark berries and licorice and grilled meat and tobacco and chocolate and spice, depending on how you make it. And in Kakheti especially, it's produced in styles from dry to fortified. Dry, semi-sweet, sweet, fortified. It really is a grape variety that has enough acidity and texture and structure and flavor that it can produce all of these styles. So we're going to talk about the PDOs in Kakheti, and that can be helpful if you're looking for a semi-sweet style or you want a dry style to understand how some of these PDOs, these appellations outline the rules for how they make their Sapuravi. Shav Capito comes from Kartli. It's more terroir expressive, especially with the body. If the body really responds to soil type. Also more berry and pomegranate, could be herbal and a little smoky. And then Tuckberry, hammerhead, also indigenous to Kartli, more medium bodied, make great dry red, rosé, sparkling, and also dessert and fortified styles of wine. This is some fun infographics. So the Georgian, the National Wine Agency, as it's called in Georgia, they have a lot of really great info sheets, infographics, information on wine regions and traveling in Georgia. So I would definitely recommend you check it out. But mostly I put this here so that when I send out the slides, you can go over that on your own. I really like the Lakumi, Racha, Imereti, Kakheti. And then it tells you the most common grape varieties in each of those regions. And you know where we're at here. We're in Kakheti. Kartli is the region surrounding Tbilisi. We talked about that before, kind of split into like the northern and the southern parts. Ajara next to the Black Sea, Samagrelo next to the Black Sea, Imereti here in the center, and so forth. And you can really see, right, that like, wow, like Guria and Ajara have the same main white and the same main red. We have the Chukveri, that red grape variety that's usually rosé or white, and Sholakuri, oftentimes for the whites. Also see Sholakuri and Samagrelo here in just north of Guria, but then we see Ojaleshi more commonly for the red. So just a fun something to look at on your own. All right, so let's talk about some of these regions. There's really not a lot of information on these wine regions so far, to be quite honest. So it's not going to take us, a lot of time to go through these. Bye, Sheila. I know you had said you were going to go to bed early since it's 12:30 where you are. So I'm glad you stopped by. So Kakheti, the most common, the most planted in terms of the grape varieties are Katsateli and Saperavi are the most important. Overall, Kakheti produces 68% of all of the wine made in Georgia. This is also the region with the best infrastructure for wine tourism. If you're going to Tbilisi, you just head over the mountain and down into Kakheti. I would recommend that you do not drink too much the night before because it is a very winding road, quite narrow, up the mountains and down the other side. But if you do drink too much, I don't want to forget to mention this, the traditional Georgian hangover cure is a sparkling mineral wine called Borjomi. And you can find it in New York if you go to like Brighton Beach, or if there's any type of kind of Russian or Georgian, I'm going to put it in the chat, Borjomi, Russian or Georgian kind of deli or kind of bodega or shop near you, wherever you are, you're going to be able to find Borjomi. It is intensely mineral and sulfuric. It's not easy to drink if you're not feeling that well because you had too much to drink the night before, but Georgians swear by it. Their hangover cure. So maybe have some Borjomi before you get into the car to head up and down the mountain pass from Tbilisi into Kakheti. So the most common PDOs, these aren't all of them. You have Kakheti, mostly known for Katsateli, Mitvani, Kokuri, and Saperavi. And the PDOs, they follow the traditional European system and the French model of appellation system, but they're a little bit more relaxed. Usually the PDOs allow for a wider interpretation of grape varieties and how you can make your wine, but some of them are a little bit more specific. Like Manavi PDO is based on 85% Mitvane with up to 15% Arkatsateli, but you can choose to make that. It's always a white in either the European or the traditional Crevery method. In Kashmir, we make Saperavi is the only grape that can be used for the PDO, but it's a cooler mountain terroir. So you'll get that higher acidity, that tighter tannin. Naparuli, so let's just point them out. Naparuli, Sinandali, and Mukuzani are considered the top tier PDOs, I would say. Naparuli can be made from Arkatsateli, Kisi, and Saperavi. It's also in the north, so it can be a little bit higher acidity, a little bit fresher and brighter than something like Cavarelli PDO, also for Saperavi, which is in the more southern part, closer to the border of Azerbaijan. It tend to be a little bit warmer in the southern parts here. Kinsmaruli is always 100% Saperavi, but it has to be made in a semi-sweet style. By law, it needs to be between 30 to 50 grams per liter of residual sugar. Usually it's around 35. So it's usually on the drier side of the production limits for the Kinsmaruli style of wine. Sinandali is the heart of the Kakhetian wine region. It's also for white wines. They can be made in the traditional or European method. The whites have to be based on 85% Arkatsateli and can be complemented with up to 15% of the Mitvane that come from Kakheti. Tiliani is the only PDO in Georgia, I believe, as far as I know so far, that allows for Cabernet Sauvignon or for any international grape variety. So again, not all of Georgia is covered in the PDO system. There's only 20 altogether. So there's a lot of larger regions. Like you could make a wine from Imereti that could probably be from any grape variety that you could plant. You could make a wine from Kakheti, just the region in general, that could be blends or different international grape varieties. But if you're going to use the PDO itself, the protected name, you have to follow those limitations, right? So Tiliani for Cabernet Sauvignon, Mukuzani is Saperavi, oftentimes aged in oak. This is usually Georgia's most intense expression of Saperavi wine. Georgiani is also ripe and juicy and plump for Arcatatelli and Saperavi, because it's also located a little bit more in the south here. And then some others. You have Tabani PDO for Qvevri aged, Arcatatelli. You have another sweet wine PDO, the Cardinaki fortified style of Saperavi. From any grape with up to 100 grams per liter of residual sugar. So fortified sweet styles of wine. And there's a lot to explore in this region. And if we were thinking, like, just to give you an idea of like the climate, there's many different soil types, so it's just really too difficult. There's a lot of different aspects. If you think back to the topographical map, you have mountains, you have valley floor, you have foothills and everything in between. So these PDOs, and also the PDOs, which I did not put on here because it's just way too much to get into for just a kind of a Georgian class, but they do also have Liud. So it won't be uncommon to maybe begin to see these smaller Liud or vineyard areas within a PDO also listed on a label. Some of the producers that you really should look out for, I think they're easier to find. These are some of the ones I see most common in the US. Aliverdi Monastery. So this was the monastery from the beginning slide. You'll see this a lot. A lot of winemakers have had former careers in architecture, in law, as doctors, as cardiothoracic anesthesiologist, we'll talk about a little bit later on. And the bishop for Aliverdi Monastery was an architect before he became a monk. It's located just in the center of the Alazani Valley, and they're known for making only Qvevri style wine, all produced from caceti fruit. So not all of their grapes come from that valley floor right around the monastery. They source a lot of those from the hillsides as well. The winemaking facilities here do date back to the 7th or 8th century. They've been uncovered, they're not in use, but it's only been since 1011 that they actually have documentation of winemaking. So they've uncovered winemaking, tools and presses and facilities dating back to the 7th century, but the documentation of winemaking starts in 1011. Lagvanari, run by Echo Glanti, also, so I mentioned him, the cardiothoracic anesthesiologist turned Qvevri wine producer. He only makes Qvevri wine. He's really obsessed with soil health, vineyard management, winery hygiene. As we mentioned before, all of these wineries really are young. There's not a lot of back production of these wines to go back and taste, right? We don't have library verticals of wine dating back to the, even to like the 90s, right? Most of the production is sold immediately because a lot of them are small facilities who need the cash flow. They can't really hold their own wine back. And a lot of them are experimenting, and sometimes some vintages are better than others in terms of the competence of the winemaking and in terms of the microbial stability of the wine. So I don't want to say these things to scare you, but I want to be honest about what you can expect with these wines, and let you know too that sometimes the next vintage might be much better. So if you do get a bottle of wine that you're like, I don't know, this is kind of funky, I don't know what's going on, if it's within your budget and within your mind to maybe try it again at another time, and I would recommend it because the wine might be quite different. Pheasant Tears is a larger production. It's a lot easier to find in the US. John Werderman is Georgia's most widely known producer. He is an American. He went to Georgia as an artist. He heard about this kind of Georgian artist community in the mountains. He went there. He met a woman who became his wife. And he and his wife are really important for promoting Georgian culture, especially Georgian song, dance, and art. And he was approached in the mid-2000s by a winemaker that really wanted to start a project with him, because John Werderman, being an American, really can talk to people about the wines. He can spread the kind of the Qvevri knowledge. And also he had a great aptitude, not necessarily because he was American, but just himself. He had a great aptitude for both marketing and sales. So marketing, promotion, and sales. So he really had done a lot to promote the Qvevri style of winemaking and the producers. He does make his wine with minimal intervention. I will say his wines are very, very tannic. He really, there can be, just to be honest, a little bit heavy-handed, but they are really easy to find and they're not too expensive. Orgo and Dakishvili family cellars. Gogi Dakishvili studied in Odessa and at UC Davis. So if you ask him, if you were to meet him, go to Orgo, and you would ask him, what do you like to drink from other places in the world? He would be able to give you all sorts of great California and Burgundy and Spanish wines that he's drank. Now, when I went in 2016, there were not a lot of producers at that time that could really say that. They would be, I don't know, like a lot of them were like, I haven't had a lot of wines outside of Georgia. I live in Georgia. I've had Georgia wine at the super my whole life. He does use a little bit of neutral barrel to age his wines. He does make some traditional method sparkling wines as well. And his vines are quite old, which is also a little bit more uncommon. So 60 to 80-year-old vines are Castatelli, Kisi, Saparavi. Shumi is the winery that I wanted to drink here. They have a vineyard collection of over 400 indigenous varieties on their property. They're not making wine from all of these grapes and these varieties. It's just it's like a vineyard that they do keep there. But they make a range of both Qvevri, stainless steel, and oak aged wines. Our wine is a favorite of mine. 4 friends. So this is two decanters filled with our wines. It's 4 friends who created wine to drink for themselves, which was very common in Georgia. And they decided, and they were told that they should start bottling and selling it because it was so good. And it really is. They're one of, I think, the most high quality traditional Georgian winemakers. And the wines are consistently good. Soliko was really well known as being one of Georgia's most ardent supporters of traditional winemaking. He was one of those supporters in the early 2000s that really pushed producers to become interested in traditional wines again. But unfortunately, a couple of years ago, 2018, I think he passed away. So moving into Kartli. So Kartli is the home province of Tbilisi. There's a lot of renewed interest in grape varieties like Takveri, Shav Capito, more Western grapes like Ojaleshi, Sholakuri, and Krakuna as well. We do see a little bit more of a homogeneous soil in Kartli. There's a lot of yellow sandstone, and a lot of it had been used to build some of the larger buildings in Tbilisi as well. So you'll see that. There are 2 PDOs of note, which are Ateni, which is a PDO for sparkling wines based on Chunuri and Guruli Mitvane. You can add Budashuri Tetri, a grape variety we haven't mentioned yet, and Aligote, interestingly enough. Bolnisi PDO, you can make dry red, white, amber, or rosé wines from a number of grape varieties that you see here. Takveri, Shav Capito, Saparavi, Castatelli, Chunuri. The most important producers, Gotsa Wines, Beka Gotsadze, another former architect, and he used his knowledge to build his winery into a mountainside. He was also somebody who wanted to move away from the city. He wanted to work more with his hands. He wanted to leave corporate life. He moved his family to this mountainside where he is growing grapes and making wine. He is always experimenting. He ferments all of his wines but Chunuri with the stems, and he's also experimenting with petnat, beer, cider. He only started his winery in, I think, maybe like 2006, 2007, and he is probably one of the older, more established producers as well. Ori Morani, this is actually a French-born and educated winemaker who also married a Georgian woman and realized that his first plan, which was to establish a winery in Champagne, was going to cost a lot more money than establishing a winery in Georgia. So the main focus, the winery is pretty young, but the main focus will be traditional method sparkling wine. Right now they're working with wild yeast fermentation. Primarily they're fermenting in neutral oak barrels, like large neutral oak, and a little bit in Qvevri. So I'm really excited to see where that production might go. I haven't had an opportunity to taste the wine yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. So Imereti, Georgia's second largest wine growing region. And you can see we're just up here in the center. It's a cooler, it's a lot wetter than Kartli and Kakheti on the eastern side of the mountain range that separates them, the Liki. The Black Sea moderates more of the summer and winter temperatures as we begin to get a little bit closer. We do see, again, a slightly more homogeneous soil. We see volcanic rock. We have terra rosa soils here on limestone, heavy clay as well, which will change the characteristic of some of the grapes that you might see here. We see a lot less of the skins and the stems used in traditional winemaking. Shrivy PDO is the only PDO we see in the area for dry white from Sholakuri, Titsa, and Krakuna, all white grape varieties. And we do see, aside from the PDO, we see white and red dry wine primarily. And oftentimes you will see on the label of the wine that will say, it won't list the PDO, it will just list Imereti, wine of Imereti. But oftentimes it will list a village of origin on the label also. Producers include Baya's wine. She would really encourage to make wine by some of Georgia's top winemakers. Not a lot of female winemakers in Georgia. Both of her siblings and her mother are involved in the enterprise. She has two lines. So Baya makes her white wines, typically aged in Qvevri, and Gavansa for the red wines. Gaios Sopermadze, if you joined us at Corkbuzz right before we closed down due to the pandemic in 2020, you would have had this wine by the glass. We had his Krakuna white, aged in Qvevri by the glass. The first in the area to bottle wines and to sell as a natural wine. His sons are taking over today. And Rama Nikoladze, he loves Sholakuri. He said that Sholakuri, the white grape, is the mirror of the soil. He doesn't use any sulfur in the winery, so the wine can be a little bit variable. But Ramas was also a really known, just like him and Soliko that I mentioned from our wines just a couple of slides ago. They were really two of those producers that were just hell-bent on traditional Georgian winemaking. And they in the mid-2000s, they opened this underground wine bar in Tbilisi with a handful of other producers to actually sell traditional style Georgian natural wine. So it was they were really ahead of their time for what they were doing there as well. Rakhma Lakumi is in the north. It's a very small region. It should be considered really two separate winemaking areas, but they're oftentimes considered collectively because the production is so small. Kavanchara PDO is one of the most famous wines in Georgia for semi-sweet red, very popular in Russia. Lakumi tends to be a little bit more primitive in its winemaking. Usually they'll ferment many different styles of grapes or grape varieties in barrel or in the churi, the Western term for Qvevri, with a very short skin contact. Tvishi PDO is semi-sweet styles of wine from the white grape. Sholakuri, and perhaps I don't need to keep reminding you which ones are whites and which ones are reds. You probably have got this already, but just in case, the reason I just keep saying it again is because I know that these are oftentimes grape varieties that nobody has heard about before. So I think it just helps to repeat. Are we talking about white or red grapes in this case? Two of the most kind of popular or common producers that you'll see in Racha. And most of the producers I'm listing, I'm not really listing any of like the really, really big producers. I'm really kind of listing Lisa's recommendation for the smaller, more artisanal producers, the ones that I know that a lot of our guests really prefer to promote. So Iliasuli family cellar, organic producer, less than 2 hectares of vines, tiny. They work with stainless steel. They're doing a lot of experimental cuvées, but I don't know that they're working with any Quarvery. And Gogi Margvelidze, also a natural producer. So he crushes all of his wine in the Satnikeli. And the Satnikeli is that trough where we usually see in Kaketti, I had it in a picture earlier, where you crush the grapes before actually putting them into the Quarvery. And he separates his grape by the character into the vessels with or without skin, depending on how we think the wine will develop due to the vintage condition. Samagrelo. So here we're in a very mountainous region. We're adjacent to the Black Sea. Most of the vineyards are on foothills. You might see them in river gorges. We have a climate that's really influenced by the Black Sea. So for Samagrelo, for Guria, for Ajara, these are really subtropical regions. So it would almost be impossible to take any of the kind of more common Western European grape varieties and grow them here. They really wouldn't do well. You need these traditional Georgian varieties, right? So most of the vines, because of the climate, are planted Maglari style. What does that mean? They're growing up trees. Sholkori and a grape variety we also haven't mentioned before, Chivitluri are the most common. And you see a lot of the outdoor winemaking, the Quarvery that will be buried in the ground just outside. Oda House Winery, the winery really promoted to reviving a lot of the old grape varieties of the region as well. Guria, just here. So we were just talking about Samagrelo, now Guria, also on the Black Sea, subtropical. Guria is the most humid region that you're going to find in Georgia. Because of that, the best grapes are going to come from the more hilly or mountainous area that have sunny exposures to help keep those grapes dry, free from fungal disease. We have a little bit more of a homogeneous igneous soil with red clay and aluminum oxide. It's known, surprisingly, for being right next to the Black Sea. Usually in these kind of more humid or seaside places, we see a lot more white grape varieties. But Chukveri, the red, is the most common grape variety, Maglari train. Chukveri is that red grape, usually vinified as a white or rosé. Ibirelli is a well-known producer, Zurab Topuridze. Sorry about that. Now that I've been trying to speak Georgian names for an hour, now it's a little bit getting to be a little bit of a tongue twister. So Zurab built terraces, planted using Masal selection vine material from a very old vineyard collection. He grew 12 Gurian grape varieties. And although he thought he knew what they all were when they were planted, they're not all quite turning out to be what we would think that the character of these grape varieties should be. So kind of remains to be seen where he's going with these 12 grape varieties that he's growing, but definitely somebody to keep an eye on. And Dato Kobidze, another former engineer, he returned to the village of his youth, planted Chukveri at the suggestion of one of his uncles. And he actually, so Zurab from Iberielli actually purchased 80% of his harvest for the first several years that he was working, which gave Dato a lot of the cash flow he needed to invest in his winery. He worked with a lot of local grapes in the area. And then Ajara, also adjacent to the Black Sea, subtropical, a lot of mountains here, as we mentioned. The seaside town of Ajara is a former and present and very rainy beachside resort and designation for a lot of the surrounding countries. So Russia, of course, but also some of the other surrounding countries that might not in the own country really enjoy people drinking alcohol or gambling. And Ajara is a seaside resort that says that you can do all of those things. So they have a big base of cruise ships and surrounding countries coming here to the resort, even though it is incredibly rainy, so you can't always use the day to sunbathe and dip in the Black Sea. But a lot of larger producers have invested in the area, but we haven't really seen like a big artisanal renaissance yet from the producers. We have a few smaller wine cellars. One of my favorites is Bibinishvili. They work exclusively with Chakveri. They're also Maglari trained vines. Bibinishvili is the Chakveri that I was mentioning we just had by the glass, produced as a rosé wine. And the last region we'll talk about, Semki Javakheti. Very large, it's sparsely populated. It's in southwest Georgia. Adjacent to Turkey, the area was ruled by the Ottomans from the 13th to the mid 19th century until the Russo-Turkish War. And a lot of the Georgians who fled during the Ottoman rule took vine cutting with them. So a lot of the grape varieties in the neighboring region are actually thought to be indigenous to this area. We have a lot of kind of a subtropical mountain climate. There's a lot of severe frost in the area. Natanadze is Georgie is the most well-known producer here. He reconstructed vine terraces and vineyards on a very old vineyard and cellar land that had been destroyed by invaders and left abandoned, which you see a lot of in this region. And he focuses on 7 varieties that are kind of well-known within the region as well. A few that we know, Shavkapito, Kikvi, and some others as well. I don't even know if anybody is still with me. Oh, great. All right. So the last couple of things we'll talk about is just Georgian cuisine. So now you're probably hungry. You're drinking Georgian wine. You're ready to eat some Georgian food. I showed you the picture of the supra. Get together with your friends. Have a Georgian feast. Pick somebody to be the Toastmaster, prepare some songs, some words, some poems, some toast. It really is a very, very fun evening. So what would you most commonly see on the Georgian table? Especially in Kakheti, you have that kind of warmer climate. So we see figs and persimmons and pomegranates, eggplant, tomatoes, cucumbers, herbs, and nuts. In the very first picture I showed you of the supra, you might not have noticed, but the tomatoes and the cucumbers were just set on the table whole. And that's how you typically serve. You go to the garden, you pick your tomatoes and your cucumbers. I was there in September, so it was a great harvest season. And you just put them on the table whole with a knife, and people just cut off what they want of them. And they use things like ajika, the red pepper paste, walnut or nut spreads are very common. You see a lot of kind of yogurts and fresh cheese spreads in the area, as well as tons and tons of herbs, especially during the harvest season. We're talking dill and tarragon and mint and parsley, just really kind of beautiful, fresh, vibrant herbal flavor to a lot of the food. And the herbs, just like the tomatoes and cucumbers, will usually just be put on the table whole. So you'll just tear off whatever of the herb that you're interested in adding to your plate. Kinkali are the soup dumpling you can see here. So usually you would take a little bite, you would drink the soup out just like you do with the Chinese soup dumplings, and then they're typically filled with vegetables and lamb or pork. So you don't eat the knot on the kinkali at the top here. And they say that at the end of a good meal, you know who had the most to eat or who enjoyed their meal the most by how many of the kinkali knots from the top are left on the plate. Kebabi or kebab with sumac and onion, but kebabs are incredibly important here. A lot of grilled meat, pork and lamb, again, some of the most common. You'll also see chicken and beef. Chakapuli, it's a beautiful lamb stew scented with tarragon. Khachapuri is the traditional cheese bread that you see here. Every region does it a little bit different. I think the one that people recognize most is the boat-shaped cheese bread with the egg cooked on it. The puri is the flat bread. It really looks like this. Usually it's not served with cheese and an egg, but you can use that for your dip, your vegetables, for your meat skewers as well. You see a lot of fresh kind of salty cheeses, the sort of farmer style cheese that's really common on the western side of the Black Sea, places like Romania, Bulgaria, but also on the eastern side of the Black Sea. And churchkela as well is this really common dessert. You take strings of walnuts or nuts and you dip them in a kind of boiled and condensed and pressed grape extract that then hardened. Then it's turned into kind of like a very hard, almost jelly, and you slice little slices of it and you eat it in slices. It's absolutely delicious, but you'll go to a Georgian market and you'll see the churskela just hanging everywhere. So now you'll know what they are. And if you want to explore further, this is one of those moments, like, I'm not making anything for this this plug, but this is the most comprehensive and one of the only like really serious books written on Georgian wine. Lisa Granick is you can read the story, her story yourself in the book, because not only is this a terrific reference book if you're planning a trip to Georgia, but she also, it's just very well written. And she, just to give you a little bit of her background in history, she was a Russian literature and language major. She won a Fulbright scholarship to go to Russia in the 1990 or 1991. But there was a lot of political issues at that time. So she actually had to go through Georgia first. And she really, she spent time in Georgia. She fell in love. Once she went to Russia, when she was finished with her scholarship there, she actually changed her plans to go back and spend more time in Georgia, which created for her just a really a lifelong love affair with the country. And when she gained her Master of Wine certification and diploma in the mid-2000s, she really kept her relationship with Georgian wines alive as well. So this is a very new book. It just come out within the last year or two. So it's pretty current, although, like I said, things are changing all the time. But aside from the wine regions, it's a great reference for the history, the culture, and visiting a lot of important religious and cultural sites within Georgia as well. Sorry to keep you guys all night. You're all the best. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm going to send you a recording tomorrow with the slides so that you can look at those grape varieties and everything else, all of those regions that I'm sure you're like, wait, was Kakheti or Kisi a grape variety? I can't remember at this point. But drink Georgian wine, eat Georgian food. I'll also send you a list of great Georgian restaurants in New York City tomorrow as well, so you can check those out. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Lindsay.